A sitting member of Congress makes remarks that spark outrage across the country. Within hours, calls for deportation flood social media, and then Donald Trump responds in a way that leaves even Ilhan Omar herself rattled. Today, we're going to unpack not just the headlines, but the deeper meaning of why this clash between Omar and Trump matters for America's future. In all my years watching politics unfold, I've seen plenty of controversies come and go, but there's something different about what we witnessed recently with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. This wasn't just another political dust-up that gets forgotten by the next news cycle. This was a moment that revealed something profound about where we are as a nation. And frankly, it left one of the most outspoken progressive voices in Congress visibly shaken. Let me take you back to where this all began, because the context matters enormously. Charlie Kirk, the young activist who built Turning Point USA into a powerhouse organization, has just passed away. Now, regardless of your political views, most Americans understand there's a basic decency expected when someone dies, especially someone who is a husband and father. It's one of those unwritten rules that used to bind us together as a society. But Ilhan Omar saw things differently. Within hours of Kirk's death, she was reposting content that compared him to Dr. Frankenstein, suggesting that his own monster had turned against him. Think about that for a moment. A sitting member of Congress, someone who represents hundreds of thousands of Americans, chose to use a fictional tale about a mad scientist and his creation to describe a real person's death. The imagery was deliberate, calculated, and deeply cruel. This wasn't just poor timing or a momentary lapse in judgment. Omar doubled down, calling Kirk's legacy something that belonged in what she termed the dustbin of history. She spoke about the hate she claimed he spread, painting him as some kind of villain whose death was almost poetic justice. For many Americans, particularly those who remember when public discourse had certain boundaries, this felt like crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. Now, you might wonder why this particular controversy gained such traction when political figures say inflammatory things all the time. The answer lies in something deeper than partisan politics. This wasn't Republicans getting mad at Democrats or vice versa. This struck at something more fundamental, our shared sense of basic human decency. When people across the political spectrum start questioning whether someone has gone too far, that's when you know the ground is shifting beneath someone's feet. The reaction was swift, and it was bipartisan. You had Democrats quietly expressing discomfort with Omar's timing and tone. You had independents wondering what had happened to basic respect for the deceased. And yes, you had Republicans calling for everything from censure to investigation. But this wasn't just another Twitter fight. Trump's response raised the stakes dramatically. Donald Trump, never want to let a political opportunity pass by, saw exactly what Omar had handed him. Here was someone who had positioned herself as morally superior to her political opponents, yet was showing what many saw as a shocking lack of basic human compassion. Trump's response wasn't just a tweet or an offhand comment, it was a strategic political counterpunch that would leave Omar scrambling for months to come. On Truth Social, Trump laid out what he saw as the fundamental contradiction in Omar's position. He pointed to her home country of Somalia, describing it as a place plagued by governmental chaos, widespread poverty, ongoing conflict, and systemic corruption. 70% of Somalia's population, Trump noted, lives in extreme poverty. The country consistently ranks among the world's most corrupt nations, struggling with everything from bribery to embezzlement to basic governmental dysfunction. But Trump didn't stop there. He posed a question that cut right to the heart of American frustration with certain political figures. How does someone from a country facing such enormous challenges position herself as an authority on how America should be run? It was a classic Trump move, taking the moral high ground away from his opponent by reframing the entire conversation. Then came the part that really got Omar's attention. Trump brought up what had been whispered about in certain circles for years, questions about her marriage history and whether she had married a family member to help with immigration status. Wasn't she the one that married her brother in order to gain citizenship? Trump wrote, "For years these allegations had circulated online, been investigated by some reporters, but never fully broke into mainstream political discourse." Trump just changed that. The significance of framing it around national identity and loyalty wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Here was Trump essentially asking if someone potentially committed fraud to become an American citizen, do they have the moral authority to lecture the rest of us about American values? It was a line of attack because it flipped the script entirely. Instead of defending his response to Omar's comment comments about Kirk, Trump had put Omar on the defensive about her own background and credibility, and this is where Omar's panic started to show. When someone like Ilhan Omar, who's built her entire political brand on being unafraid to speak truth to power, suddenly starts appearing defensive and rattled, something significant has shifted in the political landscape. Her appearance on CNN with Caitlin Collins became a case study in how not to handle a political crisis. Instead of showing the calm confidence of someone secure in their position, Omar appeared agitated, defensive, and increasingly desperate to change the subject. When Collins pressed her about sharing that video comparing Kirk to Frankenstein, Omar's response revealed someone who knew she was in trouble. She tried to deflect, claiming she didn't have to agree with every word in something she shared. But that defense fell flat because the Frankenstein comparison wasn't some minor detail buried in a longer piece. It was the central metaphor. She had deliberately chosen to amplify content that portrayed a recently deceased person as a mad scientist destroyed by his own creation. No amount of backpedaling could change that fundamental fact. What made matters worse was her insistence that she couldn't be deported because she was an American citizen. Now, on the surface, that sounds reasonable, but the way she said it with a kind of nervous energy that suggested she wasn't as confident as she wanted to appear told a different story. When Collins pushed back, asking about the specific allegations, Omar became even more defensive, at one point suggesting that the people calling for deportation were idiots who didn't understand basic civics. But here's what Omar missed and what Trump understood perfectly. This was never really about the technical legal question of whether she could be deported. This was about something much more powerful in American politics, the question of belonging and legitimacy. Trump wasn't necessarily expecting Omar to be put on a plane tomorrow. He was planting seeds of doubt about whether she truly represented American values and interests. The dustbin of history comment how it backfired on Omar was something to behold. When she said that Charlie Kirk's legacy should be forgotten, relegated to history's trash pile, she was trying to position herself as being on the right side of historical progress. Progressive politicians do this all the time, suggesting that their opponents represent outdated thinking that will eventually be swept aside. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Here was someone speaking at a time when emotions were raw, when Kirk's family was planning his memorial service, when even his political opponents were managing to show basic human decency. Omar's comment made her look not progressive, but callous, not morally superior, but morally bankrupt. The irony wasn't lost on Trump or his supporters. Here was Omar talking about consigning someone else to the dustbin of history. While her own political career was beginning to look increasingly precarious, Trump saw this and pounced, essentially asking, who's really going to end up forgotten by history? Charlie Kirk, who built a significant organization and influenced a generation of young conservatives, or Ilhan Omar, who's becoming known primarily for inflammatory comments and scandal. But the problem for Omar wasn't just Trump, it was her own words. When even sympathetic media outlets like CNN started pressing her on the appropriateness of her timing, when her own Democratic colleagues began distancing themselves, when the public backlash crossed party lines, that's when a politician knows they've stepped into something much bigger than a typical political controversy. The Charlie Kirk Memorial became a focal point for all of this frustration. Here was a young man who had died tragically and left behind a wife and children. The memorial service was expected to draw enormous crowds. Estimates suggested somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people might attend. What also ended up happening, around 90,000 people showed up, and it was one of the most heartwarming things I've ever seen, and I'm glad I got to be a part of it. But against this backdrop, Omar's comments looked not just inappropriate, but almost cruel. Public outrage over her Frankenstein analogy grew by the day. Social media was flooded with criticism from people who might not have agreed with Kirk's politics, but were appalled by Omar's lack of basic human decency. Even people who typically supported Omar found themselves struggling to defend her timing and tone. The memorial context and why timing mattered became a central part of the story. In American culture, there's still a strong expectation that we show respect for the deceased and their families, even when we disagreed with them in life. Omar's violation of this norm wasn't just a political misstep, it was a cultural one that resonated far beyond the usual partisan divides. What made this even more damaging for Omar was that it played into existing narratives about her character and loyalties. For years, critics had accused her of being more interested in scoring political points than in showing basic human decency. Her comments about Kirk seemed to confirm those suspicions for many Americans who had been willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Even CNN anchors questioning her comments showed how isolated she was becoming. When journalists who generally share your political worldview start pressing you on whether you've gone too far, that's a sign that you've lost control of the narrative. Collins wasn't asking gotcha questions or trying to trap Omar. She was asking the same questions that millions of Americans were asking themselves. When even sympathetic media begins to distance themselves, you know something has shifted in the political landscape. Omar found herself in the uncomfortable position of trying to defend the indefensible while simultaneously claiming she was the victim of unfair criticism. This kind of defensive posture is political poison because it makes you look both callous about your original comments and whiny about the consequences. The security situation at Kirk's memorial added another layer to the story that Omar probably hadn't anticipated. When someone showed up at the venue with weapons claiming to be conducting security sweeps, it highlighted the real-world consequences of inflammatory political rhetoric. Suddenly, this wasn't just about hurt feelings or political point scoring. It was about public safety and the responsibility that comes with holding office. The arrest of an armed individual impersonating law enforcement at the State Farm Stadium where Kirk's memorial was being held sent shockwaves through an already tense situation. This wasn't just someone making inappropriate comments online. This was a person with weapons showing up at a venue where the president and vice president were scheduled to speak, where tens of thousands of grieving Americans were gathering to pay their respects. Law enforcement agencies had been tracking intelligence about potential threats to the memorial service for days. The fact that someone managed to get close to the venue while armed and claiming to be conducting private security sweeps raised serious questions about the climate that inflammatory rhetoric creates. When politicians use dehumanizing language about their opponents, when they suggest that certain people's legacies deserve to be forgotten, it can embolden individuals who might take those messages to dangerous extremes. This incident forced a conversation that Omar probably wasn't prepared to have about the connection between inflammatory rhetoric and public safety. Here was a memorial service that required security comparable to a major sporting event with roadblocks, fencing, and hundreds of law enforcement offices, partly because the political climate had become so toxic that even honoring the dead couldn't happen without serious security concerns. But it wasn't just political fallout. It became a national security conversation that opened up discussions about something many Americans didn't fully understand: the legal reality of citizenship and deportation. The debate around whether a naturalized citizen could lose their status became a teaching moment for millions of Americans who had never considered these possibilities. Let me explain this in simple terms, because it's important to understand what Trump was really suggesting when he brought up deportation. Most Americans assume that once you become a citizen, that status is permanent and unrevocable, but that's not entirely accurate. There's a legal process called denaturalization, and while it's rare, it does happen when certain conditions are met. The law is quite specific about when naturalized citizens can lose their citizenship. If someone provided false information during their naturalization process, say lying about their identity, their relationships, or their background, that can trigger denaturalization proceedings. Serious crimes, particularly those involving treason or terrorism-related offenses, can also lead to citizenship being revoked. The process isn't automatic, and it requires court proceedings, but it is legally possible. Now, why did this legal discussion gain so much traction around Omar's case? And it wasn't just because Trump brought it up. It was because there have been persistent questions about her immigration history for years, allegations that she had married a family member to help with immigration status, if proven true, could potentially qualify as the kind of fraud that might trigger denaturalization proceedings. These weren't new accusations that Trump invented. They were claims that had been circulating among journalists and investigators for years, but had never fully broken into mainstream political discourse. What Trump did was essentially force this conversation into the open, making it impossible for Omar or the media to continue treating these questions as fringe conspiracy theories. Whether the allegations were true or false, the very fact that they were being discussed at the highest levels of American politics put Omar in an incredibly difficult position. This is where the fear became real, not just political political theater, but genuine concern about her long-term political survival. Omar's defensive reaction suggested someone who understood that this wasn't just another political attack that would blow over in a few news cycles. This was potentially career-ending if the wrong information came to light or if public opinion turned decisively against her. The political isolation within her own party became increasingly apparent as the controversy dragged on. Democratic colleagues who might normally rush to defend a fellow party member were notably quiet. Some offered tepid statements about moving on and focusing on policy, but very few were willing to explicitly defend Omar's comments about Kirk or her handling of the subsequent fallout. This kind of political abandonment is devastating for any politician, but is particularly damaging for someone like Omar. When your own party starts treating you like a liability rather than an asset, when they start distancing themselves from your positions and your rhetoric, it signals that your political capital is nearly exhausted. Behind the scenes, there were whispers about potential primary challenges, about donors becoming reluctant to associate with Omar's campaigns, about progressive organizations quietly looking for other standard-bearers who could advance similar policies without the baggage. Her approval ratings, which had never been particularly strong outside her district, began showing concerning trends even among voters who had previously supported her. The contrast with other progressive voices was telling. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders faced political attacks, their colleagues typically rallied around them, defending their right to speak truth to power. But when Omar found herself under fire, the response was much more muted. This wasn't just about political calculation. It was about a growing sense among Democrats that Omar had become more trouble than she was worth. What made this isolation even more politically dangerous was that it wasn't just coming from moderate Democrats who had always been uncomfortable with Omar's positions. Progressive colleagues who shared her policy views were also keeping their distance, currently recognizing that her comments about Kirk had crossed a line that went beyond normal political discourse. This political reality highlighted something that goes much deeper than individual personalities or specific controversies. The battle between Omar and Trump represented a broader clash between two very different visions of what America should be, and that symbolic dimension helps explain why this story resonated so powerfully with voters, particularly those over 60 who have lived through decades of cultural and political change. Omar has become, whether she intended it or not, a symbol of multicultural progressivism. The idea that America's future lies in embracing global perspectives, questioning traditional institutions, and fundamentally reimagining what American identity means. Her background as a Somali refugee who rose to Congress represents to her supporters the beautiful promise of American opportunity and inclusion, but to her critics, Omar represents something very different: the danger of divided loyalties, the risk of importing foreign conflicts into American politics, and the threat to traditional American values posed by rapid demographic and cultural change. Her willingness to criticize American foreign policy, her support for movements like BDS against Israel, and her frequent references to systemic racism and oppression make her, in their view, someone who takes American generosity for granted while working to undermine American interests. Trump positioned himself as the counterweight to everything Omar represents, embodying what we might call populist nationalism. The belief that America's leaders should put American interests first, that immigration should serve American needs rather than global humanitarian impulses, and that American values are worth preserving and defending rather than constantly questioning and deconstructing. This symbolic battle helps explain why their clash resonates so strongly with voters over 60. This demographic lived through the Cold War when questions of loyalty and patriotism weren't just political talking points, but matters of national survival. They remember when American politicians, regardless of party, generally shared certain assumptions about American exceptionalism and the importance of national unity. For many senior Americans, Omar represents a troubling departure from these shared assumptions. Her willingness to compare America unfavorably to other countries, her tendency to focus on America's historical failures rather than its achievements, and her apparent comfort with dividing Americans into oppressor and oppressed categories feels like a rejection of the national story they grew up believing in. When Trump framed his response around loyalty and belonging, he was tapping into these deeper anxieties about whether America's new generation of leaders truly shares the values and commitments that previous generations took for granted. This wasn't just about one congresswoman's inappropriate comments, it was about the direction of American culture and politics. But here's the bigger question: what happens next? The immediate political consequences for Omar are already becoming clear, and they're not pretty for someone who once seemed to have unlimited potential in progressive politics. The likelihood of formal censure by the House increased significantly after her comments about Kirk. While censure is largely symbolic, it represents a formal rebuke from her colleagues and creates a permanent record of congressional disapproval. For someone trying to build a national political profile, a central resolution is exactly the kind of baggage that becomes impossible to shake. The long-term credibility damage may be the most serious consequence of all. In politics, reputation is everything. Once voters begin to see you as someone who lacks basic judgment or human decency, it becomes incredibly difficult to regain their trust. Omar's comments about Kirk created a narrative about her character that her opponents will use against her for years to come. How scandals stick even when the law shields someone is a lesson that many politicians learn too late. You can survive legal challenges, ethics investigations, even criminal prosecutions if you maintain public support, but you can't survive the loss of public trust and respect when voters begin to see you as someone who celebrates the deaths of political opponents, who shows callousness toward grieving families, who responds to criticism with defensive anger rather than genuine reflection. That's when your political career enters terminal decline. And Trump, his move was calculated, strategic, and ultimately brilliant from a political standpoint. By responding to Omar's comments the way he did, Trump accomplished several important objectives simultaneously. He reinforced his loyalty to his base by highlighting Omar as a foil, someone whose values and behavior stood in stark contrast to what his supporters believe America should represent. The timing of Trump's response allowed him to position himself as someone who understood the importance of honoring the deceased and supporting grieving families. When he and J.D. Vance appeared at the memorial service, and they weren't just paying their respects, they were making a visual statement about the difference between leaders who understand American values and those who seem to reject them. The optics of standing beside Kirk's family at the memorial, speaking to tens of thousands of grieving Americans, and presenting himself as someone who understood the importance of unity and respect in times of loss, the kind of political jiu-jitsu, using your opponent's attack to demonstrate your own strength, is something Trump has mastered throughout his political career. He took Omar's attempt to score points against conservatives and turned it into a powerful argument for why progressive politicians can't be trusted with leadership responsibilities. So, when Omar finally showed fear, it wasn't just about Trump's words, it was about momentum, about the recognition that the political ground was shifting beneath her feet in ways that might be permanent. Politicians develop instincts about these things, and Omar's defensive reaction suggested someone who understood that this controversy might be the beginning of the end of her national political ambitions. The lessons for America's future that emerged from this controversy go far beyond the specific personalities involved. This reflects deeper divides about loyalty, free speech, and representation that will continue to shape American politics for decades to come. The question of loyalty, what we owe to our country, how we should speak about America's failures and achievements, whether criticism of American policies crosses the line into disloyalty. These aren't just abstract philosophical debates, they're practical questions that affect how we choose our leaders and how those leaders represent us on the world stage. The free speech dimension is equally complex. Omar certainly had the legal right to say what she said, but having the right to say something and having the judgment to know when not to say it are very different things. The controversy highlighted the difference between free speech and responsible speech, particularly for those in positions of public trust. The representation question gets to the heart of what we expect from our elected officials. Should representatives primarily reflect the views and values of their specific districts, or should they consider how their words and actions affect national unity and discourse? When someone like Omar makes comments that offend people far beyond her district, what responsibilities does she have to the broader American community? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're becoming increasingly urgent. As our political discourse becomes more polarized, and as social media amplifies every controversial statement, the need for accountability in public discourse has never been more apparent, particularly when inflammatory rhetoric can translate into real-world consequences like the security threats we saw at Kirk's memorial. Looking ahead to upcoming elections, this controversy offers some concerning warning signs about how intense our political rhetoric is likely to become. If anything, the exchanges between figures like Omar and Trump suggest that the temperature is only going to rise. This creates a dangerous cycle where politicians might be competing to make more and more outrageous statements to capture attention and energize their bases. What we saw with Omar's comments about Kirk and Trump's response may just be a preview of much more divisive rhetoric to come. The question is whether American voters, particularly those with the wisdom and experience that comes with age, will reward or punish this kind of behavior at the ballot box. The stakes couldn't be higher. When our political leaders can't even maintain basic civility around death and grief, when they can't show elementary human decency to families who have lost loved ones, it suggests that our political culture is breaking down in ways that threaten the foundations of democratic discourse. And that brings us to the takeaway from all of this. So Ilhan Omar finally got scared, not because Trump tweeted something sharp, but because the ground beneath her political career is shaking. These moments remind us how fragile trust in leadership really is, and how fast momentum can change in American politics. What we witnessed wasn't just another political controversy that would be forgotten by the next news cycle. This was a revealing moment that exposed fundamental questions about character, judgment, and what we should expect from the people we elect to represent us. Omar's reaction to Kirk's death, her defensive responses to criticism, and her apparent surprise at the backlash all suggested someone who had lost touch with basic American values about decency and respect. Trump's response showed an understanding of these values that resonated with millions of Americans who were appalled by Omar's behavior. His ability to position himself as the defender of common decency while making Omar look callous and out of touch was a masterclass in political communication. For those of us who remember when American politics had certain boundaries, when there were things that politicians simply didn't say or do regardless of their party affiliation, this controversy represents both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is clear. If we don't demand better from our political leaders, if we don't hold them accountable for basic standards of human decency, our political discourse will continue to deteriorate. But the opportunity is equally important. Moments like this clarify choices for voters in ways that typical policy debates often don't. When politicians reveal their true character under pressure, when they show us who they really are, when they think no one important is watching, they give us valuable information about whether they deserve our trust and our votes. The American people, in their wisdom, tend to recognize authentic leadership when they see it, and they tend to reject politicians who seem more interested in scoring points than in serving their constituents with dignity and respect. Omar's defensive panic when confronted with the consequences of her own words suggests she understood, perhaps too late, that she had crossed a line that most Americans weren't willing to accept. This story is only just beginning because the fundamental questions it raises about loyalty, decency, accountability, and leadership will continue to shape American politics long after this specific controversy fades from the headlines. The choices we make about the kind of leaders we're willing to accept will determine not just who wins elections, but what kind of country we leave for future generations. Now I'd like to hear from you. What do you think about Trump's response? Do you believe Omar should face consequences beyond politics? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with a friend because most likely this story is only just